My wife hasn't slept since we moved into our dream apartment. Last night, I finally figured out why. It was late July when my wife, Ada, and I moved into our new apartment on Maple Street. The road was a welcome addition to a newly built neighborhood, the apartments of which were all modern and highly sought after. We were planning to start a family, and the district seemed like the perfect place to do it. The leaflets depicted a child-friendly environment, and the billboards on the highway showed photographs of laughing couples and BBQ get-togethers. Granted, the apartments on Maple Street were far more expensive than those in any other part of the city. I noticed the asking price while Ada was scrolling through the photos of the ad, and by the time she was done explaining the intricacies of the bathroom, my underarms were soaked in a cold sweat. "Baby," I began, playing for time, "don't you think we ought to look at something a bit more affordable? How about someplace nearer the station? I mean, the apartments there aren't as new, but they have some pretty solid options." But Ada stuck out her bottom lip and whimpered, "But Alex, I really don't want a second-hand apartment. Think of our baby. We need to have the best." I sighed, fully aware that I was neither going to change her mind, nor did I have much of a say in the matter. We didn't have a baby yet. In fact, Ada wasn't even pregnant, but she sure had a very pronounced idea of what kind of family dynamic she wanted us to have. I knew she'd taken one look at the photos of the clean-cut white stone playgrounds and the surrounding benches with clay flower pots, and her mind was made up. There was no point in arguing or trying to get her to see otherwise. So we bought it. The day the apartment complex finally opened for its new residents, the entire courtyard was bustling with life. Large groups of movers gathered in the residential plaza, laden with dozens of suitcases and plastic bags. Their kids tugged behind them, clamoring for a drink, an ice cream, or the bathroom. And pets were causing a ruckus from inside their kennels. The sight was truly chaotic, but Ada seemed delighted. "It's just like the ads," she cried, clasping her hands to her chest and making her way through the chattering crowd. I followed closely behind, struggling under the weight of our belongings. Our apartment was on the 6th floor. It was bright and spacious, with large paned windows stemming from the floor all the way up to the ceiling. We had to pay extra to get it furnished, but Ada was adamant about having everything ready before the big day. "I don't want to sleep on the floor for the first 2 months," she wailed, jabbing at the furniture catalog. "And what about the leather couch? Can we get that one too?" I told her we could. After all, what are $2,000 in comparison to a $500,000 purchase? I'd already come to terms with the fact that I'd be paying off the mortgage until I drew my final breath. Still, I didn't mind too much at the time. We were young newlyweds, and the apartment was roomy, modern, with a beautiful view. I told myself it was an investment. Things took a turn for the worse only a couple of nights into our new life. Ada woke me up in tears in the early hours to tell me she'd had the most bizarre dream. "I dreamt I was falling," she whispered, clutching my arm. "It was so realistic, Alex. I even felt it when I hit the ground." She burst into tears and refused to go back to sleep, emphasizing how vivid the dream was and how she could still feel the implications of the fall, despite being awake. She seemed really shaken up, so I got up to calm her down and make breakfast. It was only a bad dream, I kept repeating. She felt better after a long cuddle and some peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, but the following night was no different. "Alex," I woke up to Ada sitting on the ground, knuckling her eyes and hissing at me. I had the same dream. I brushed away the covers and lifted her back onto the mattress. "Are you all right? What are you doing on the floor?" "I must have," she sobbed. "I must have fallen out of bed." Once again, Ada was wide awake at 3 in the morning, so I put on a DVD and wrapped her in my arms like a cocoon, hoping sleep would eventually find her. I couldn't help feeling like I was missing out on my own rest though, since whenever I tried to close my eyes, Ada shook me and snapped her fingers. "Please don't leave me," she wailed. "I'm scared." I did my best to fight against my natural instincts. I fought long and hard, sometimes for several hours at a time, only paying the price after I got to work. With droopy eyelids and a brain fried from watching reruns of nitty sitcoms at 3 a.m., I had no chance of getting anything productive done during the day. The cycle continued for several nights until one evening I caught Ada coming out of the bathroom. She had just taken a shower and was tiptoeing into the walk-in closet, a towel draped loosely around her upper body. Our eyes met and I smiled, but she didn't reciprocate, instead flinching and hastening her step. That's when my gaze slid down to her legs. "What is that?" I asked, alarmed, grabbing hold of her forearm and stopping her in her tracks. "Ada, what happened?" Her thighs and calves were peppered with bruises, some very large and blue, others smaller and brown. In several places, the bruising was so bad I couldn't even see her beautiful skin. She saw me looking and tried to cover them up with the hem of the towel, but I had already seen enough. She stuttered. "It's nothing, Alex, don't look at me." She tried to brush past me, but I stopped her. "What do you mean it's nothing? Look at you. You're hurt. Tell me what happened. Who did this to you?" She sniveled and clutched the towel tighter. I must have fallen out of bed one too many times. I was about to protest. I was about to suggest she see a doctor for her nightmares, when the room was abruptly enveloped in blue-red flashing lights. We jumped to the bedroom window and stared down at the street. An ambulance was pulling in slowly through a crowd of people gathered beside the main entrance. "What the hell?" I spat, cracking the window open. "What's going on down there?" "Maybe one of the neighbors came down with that flu that's going around," Ada suggested, attempting to avert my gaze with a pair of sweatpants. "Oh, I hope they're okay. I'll go down and check," I said, grabbing my phone off the table and pulling on my sneakers. "Stay here. I'll be back in a minute." I made my way down the stairwell, my lungs buzzing in my chest. Despite the building being brand new, the elevator didn't seem to be working. Either that, or it simply wasn't ready yet. I'd have considered this nothing but a minor inconvenience, if it wasn't for the fact that by the time I descended all the flights of stairs, I was rather sweaty and out of breath. "What happened?" I asked one of the passers-by, who was eagerly spectating the commotion. "Oh," he shook his head solemnly. "A man jumped from the 8th floor. Must have been a suicide. He was young too, couldn't have been over 35. Fell on top of that bench over there." I gawked at him, but he did not seem interested in making further conversation. We hadn't had the chance to get to know our neighbors, but the young man's death shook me to my core. I looked away as two paramedics with a stretcher made their way through the crowd. I stood there for a while, pondering the questions of life and death, even as the spectators scattered and returned to their homes. "Come along, dear, nothing to see here." An elderly woman shook her head at me. "Go on home." I returned to my own apartment, desperately trying to hold back tears. Ada was waiting for me in the doorway and didn't hesitate to ask questions. "Is it the grandmother from the apartment below us? Has she come down with something? I met her the other day when I was going to the supermarket." "Oh, Alex, she's such a sweet lady. I couldn't bear if anything happened to her." I wasn't sure whether telling Ada about the evening's events was a good idea. She was already burdened enough by her relentless nightmares and hadn't been able to sleep properly since we moved in. I didn't want to risk making matters worse, so I brushed it off and simply told her I hadn't been able to find out. "Well, did you ask anyone?" "Yeah, I asked around," I said, taking my shoes off and making my way into the kitchen. No one was sure. They just came to see the ambulance. I knew all too well how ridiculous my answer must have sounded, but honestly, it beat facing yet another one of Ada's nightmares. Let's just go to bed, darling," I said, sweeping her up into my arms and carrying her to our bedroom. It's probably nothing. Don't you worry about it." She conceded, allowing me to help her out of her clothes and tuck her in. I shut the bedroom blinds as innocuously as I could, something I never did, but Ada didn't seem to notice. "Do you want to watch a movie to help you sleep?" I asked, and she nodded. Even from the other side of the room, I could see how tired she looked. Her eyelids were half shut, and I knew she wouldn't last through the opening credits. I was right. As soon as the title of the film appeared in big bold letters across the screen, Ada was out of it. I watched her for a couple of minutes, mentally accounting for the events I'd witnessed that day. I remembered her legs, beaten, covered in bruises. I couldn't bear the thought of it. Gently, I lifted the covers and stared at them, my own skin prickling. How had this happened? To my knowledge, Ada had only fallen out of bed 3 times, and neither one of those falls could have possibly resulted in something so vile. Was she hurting herself? I went to sleep that night with a heavy conscience. Everything seemed wrong. Our forever home, as Ada kept calling it, despite me telling her that the expression wasn't suitable, seemed to be getting more and more temporary by the day, and I couldn't help feeling like we had been better off in the small 1-bedroom apartment I had sold. I woke up in the middle of the night and immediately felt for my wife, but she wasn't there. The room was pitch black, so I felt the floor on both sides of the bed, thinking that perhaps she had fallen out again, but my search yielded no results. Ada, I called, making my way into the hallway, baby. But the apartment was as silent as a tomb. Ada, I tried again, my voice hoarse. Where are you? Then I heard it, a faint thudding sound coming from the kitchen. I couldn't tell what it was, but it sounded like a grandfather clock that had gone haywire. Rhythmic, low vibrations reverberated throughout the apartment, stopping and then starting up again. Ada. She didn't even flinch when the kitchen lights came on. She was standing with her back to me in front of the counter, chopping something on one of the wooden cutting boards. Ada? I stood in the doorway, my stomach churning. What are you doing? No answer. The only sound was that of the knife landing in short bursts on the cutting board. I approached her, pulled her hair out of her face, and peeked over her shoulder. I wish I hadn't. The cutting board was covered in blood. The fingers of her left hand were spread, and the knife aimed for the spaces in between. Her hand was covered in scratches and cuts, bubbles of pink flesh peeking through the incisions. Her pinky finger lay turned into mush in the corner of the cutting board, as blood from the wound trickled onto the white kitchen tiles. Ada. I yelled, snatching the crimson knife out of her hands and tossing it to the other side of the room. What the? Before I could finish that thought, Ada collapsed onto the floor, gasping on impact. Alex? She sounded hysterical. Where am I? What's going on? I was about to give her a piece of my mind when she noticed her left hand. She stared at it in shock, her face turning a myriad of different shades. All that remained of her pinky was no more than a chunk of ground meat, dangling limply from the rest of her hand. We need to get you to a hospital, I said firmly. I should call an ambulance. No ambulance, please, Ada whispered. We can't afford it. Look, I can walk. She scrambled to her feet and wobbled across the kitchen in a shaky line before falling to her knees. We were lucky the emergency room wasn't too busy that night. We only spent about 20 minutes waiting before the doctor called us in. He stitched up some of Ada's most dire cuts but couldn't save her pinky. How did this happen? He asked, staring at my wife over the top of his spectacles. But Ada was out of it. She was lying on the bed with her eyes shut and only whimpering ever so slightly every few minutes. A knife, I murmured. It was an accident. The doctor shook his head. A knife makes stab wounds, but your wife's finger, well, it's been pulverized. I chewed my inner lip. I don't know what to tell you, Doc. I wasn't there when it happened. I walked in when it was already in its current state. And you're telling me your wife has no recollection of the events? No, she seemed disoriented, to say the least, as if she had just woken up. She's been having these vivid nightmares every night, and her legs are all bruised up too, and... The doctor raised his index finger. I have reason to suspect your wife might be suffering from somnambulism. Now, I can't be sure until we run some tests, but... What's that? I interrupted. Well, he continued patiently, Have you considered that your wife is, perhaps, sleepwalking? I gawked at him, and no. Wouldn't I have noticed if she did? He nodded towards Eda. Your wife is chronically exhausted. You might want to keep an eye on her until you can make an appointment with your family doctor. So, I did. It was very difficult for Ada to come to terms with her new diagnosis. She tossed and turned every night before going to sleep, and often resorted to slipping out of bed quietly and keeping herself occupied in the living room. Ada, baby, you can't just not sleep. Remember, the doctor said the more sleep-deprived you are, the worse it'll get. I'm scared, Alex. She'd tell me. What if I decide to chop my entire hand off, or something? What if I hurt you? One of us has to stay awake. So I stayed awake as long as I could manage. I didn't even go to bed anymore. I sat in the living room with a bottle of scotch and a stack of DVDs, guarding my wife against her own nightmares. My job took the backseat, and I started coming in disheveled and sleep-deprived. My boss noticed, of course. He didn't pry and only asked me to take a couple of days off to rest. I can't do this anymore. I told Ada last night, honey, I'm going to lose my job. Something has got to give. She stared at me, her blue eyes brimming with tears. I'm sorry, I didn't mean for things to get out of hand. I just want everything to be okay again. I promised her it would, and before she could protest, added, hey, you know what? I have an idea. Her eyes lit up. What is it? It's just a thought. I began, opening the kitchen drawer, and we don't have to do it if you're uncomfortable. I rummaged through the drawer and pulled out a small coil of rope left over from Christmas. Well, perhaps this might stop you from getting up. I could see the idea going round and round in her brain. She joined me at the kitchen counter and examined the rope, silently wrapping it around her wrist and entwining it through her fingers. Feels a bit naughty, she giggled, but then nodded. Let's do it. She skipped into the bedroom and sprawled out on the bed, her arms and legs spread as wide as she could manage. I laughed and shook my head. I don't think that's necessary, honey. This isn't an exorcism. Oh, her face fell. Well, maybe it should be. Okay. How do you want me then? Well, I began, pulling her wrists together and wrapping the rope around them. My main concern is to make sure you're comfortable, so tell me if it's too tight. And you not cutting off any more body parts is only a bonus. When her hands were tied, I moved down to her ankles. I'm going to attach one of the rope ends to the bedpost. This way, even if you sleepwalk, you'll need to work really hard to free yourself, waking me up in the process. Hopefully. Her laugh was shaky. You have about 2 weeks of sleep to catch up on. I'll be surprised if you wake up at all. I knew she was only trying to be funny, but her joke left a bitter taste in my mouth. Ever since we'd moved into Maple Street, everything seemed to be going downhill. Fast. Okay, are you comfortable? I asked, getting up from the bed and looking over the contraption I had made of my wife. She nodded, and I tucked her in, giving her a peck on her forehead. Then I trudged through each room, turning off the lights and praying that at least once I'd be able to sleep through the night. When I woke up, it was still dark. I checked my phone, which read 3:23 a.m. My first thought was that my body had become accustomed to sleep deprivation and instinctively knew when to wake up to check on Ada. I angled my phone screen towards her side of the bed, expecting to see her sleeping peacefully by my side. But she was gone. There were no signs she'd ever been there in the first place. The rope was missing, and her side of the bed was uncreased, as if she'd never gone to sleep in the first place. Oh, fuck, I whispered, getting out of bed and flipping on the lights. I checked each side of the bed. I even checked under it. I went through each room in the apartment, flipping on all the switches and calling her name to no avail. I checked the kitchen, the bathroom. Hell, I even cracked the front door open to see if she was there, despite locking it every evening myself. Ada, I called desperately. Please answer me. My words were met with a ringing silence. I wanted to fall to my knees and weep. Where was she? She couldn't have just disappeared into thin air. Every window and door had been locked. I slipped my feet into my shoes and grabbed my coat, fully intending to go out looking for her all the same, when a voice intercepted my thoughts. "Alex," she called. "I'm down here." I stood still, a chill crawling up my spine. "Down where?" "We lived on the 6th floor." "Down here," she giggled. "Open the window." I rushed to the window, pried it open, and stuck my head out. "Where?" "You're not looking." She sounded dismayed. "Look down." I edged farther up the windowsill, sticking my head out the window, yet I could see no sign of my wife. "Closer," she demanded. "You're not looking." Desperately clutching the window pane, I stuck my upper body farther out into the night. My knees were buckling as I kneeled on the edge of the windowsill, and sweat was dripping down the small of my back. I scanned the road below, but there was no sign of her. There was no sign of anyone. "Alex!" A sudden high-pitched shriek nearly made me topple over. Ada was lying on her side of the bed, still tied up, screaming bloody murder. "What the fuck are you doing? Have you lost your fucking mind?" My palms felt slippery against the window pane, and my heart was practically leaping out of my throat. I stared at her, unsure of what to say or do. My head was spinning and my balance wavering. "Alex, get down from there, right now," she squirmed, trying to free herself from her rope prison. "What the fuck are you doing?" I stammered. "I don't. I swear to God, either you get down right now, or I will." She didn't finish her sentence, and instead burst into tears. I obeyed, sliding down from the windowsill and crumpling onto the floor. What the fuck had just happened? Had I almost taken my own life? Had I almost left my wife tied up and incapacitated in our own bed? "Alex," Ada whispered. "What happened?" I couldn't answer her. I didn't know what to say. How could I have possibly explained this to her? How could I have possibly told her that she had been calling me from outside the window? Tears welled up in my eyes, but I blinked them away. A gust of wind blew a leaf inside the room, and I scrambled to my feet to shut the window. The night air was crisp and refreshing on my flushed skin. I stared at the dark neighborhood. In the dead of night, it looked empty and derelict. The only sound was that of the trees whispering and a shriek of sirens in the distance. Suddenly, a light came on in the adjacent building. In a sea of black, the little square of light seemed almost inviting. I watched as a woman ran up to the window and opened it. She stood there motionless for a few seconds, staring into nothingness. Then, she leaned down, farther and farther, looking down for some invisible blade of grass, a hidden entity, a voice. I watched her until I couldn't watch anymore, shutting the window a second before the reverberating splat.